do the important stuff. So those of you who don't know enough about NEAR should know that it's probably the biggest income generating centre we have, not only in this building, but possibly one of the largest in the university. It's run by my mate, Dr. Steve Barnett, and they do some really amazing research and policy informing work for both states and the national government and many other people interested in early childhood education. And the group at NEAR have been doing really good cross-cutting work for a long time, and unfortunately, because they're not located in this building, we don't get to hear a lot about their work. So I'm delighted today to introduce actually 3 of my mates from NEAR who do wonderful work around coaching and have been doing some great work in kindergarten. I'm going to introduce each of them separately, and in case you don't know, we also have other people from NEAR here. So we have Alison. Just raise your hand, Alison. All right, and we have Quinn, who does lots of statistics. And then we have Jorie Quinn. And Jorie, before she came to NEAR, used to work at the Liberty Science Centre. And she's now currently a research coordinator at the National Institute for Early Education Research. Jorie has been a preschool teacher, and she's worked in science and math, and particularly STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And she's done a lot of work with places like Fairleigh Dickinson University, and currently does a lot of work around coaching, but also works with Dr. Ayers and I on the state guidelines project for the State Department of Education. And she's always a really great help to the work that we do. Our other person is Alexandra Figueras Daniel, and Alexandra is actually also a PhD student here. And I'm trying to think when we first met, she used to work in the Elizabeth Public Schools as a pre-K teacher, has done a ton of work around dual language learners, and is in fact even developed a measure designed to sort of look at the kinds of instruction going on with dual language learners in early childhood classrooms. She's published work to that effect, and she is what we call a senior research project coordinator in NEAR, which means she runs a number of different projects for the National Institute for Early Education Research, and she's going to finish that wonderful PhD dissertation soon, right, Dr. Daniel to be. All right. And then finally, we have Dr. Riley Ayers, who I just love working with. She's the best collaborator ever because she doesn't get really angry when you're late on the projects that you must do, right? But she's also a very accomplished researcher in her own right in terms of literacy research. Some of you may know that she co-wrote a book with Dr. Dorothy Strickland around literacy coaching, one of the first books, I think, on coaching, before coaching became like everyone goes, oh yeah, you've got to have coaches as part of your professional development models in schools. She also works at NEAR, does a lot of work around leadership. You may have heard about the Centre for Early Education Learning Outcomes at NEAR, which is a technical assistance centre funded by the federal government to a tune of about $5 million, I reckon. And Dr. Riley Ayers is one of the key leaders in that initiative. And she is someone who does a range of quantitative and qualitative work focused on professional development, leadership, and literacy. And I can't tell you what a buzz it is to have them here, and I hope you give them a wonderful, warm welcome.
Thanks, Sharon. We are really excited to be here and share with you our work. One thing about this research is that it is really grounded in the classroom. So it's research, but it's also about an intervention. With the 3 of us coming from the classroom to teacher, we really try to make sure that the research that we're doing has a direct impact. So today we'll talk about the coaching project that we've done in a district here in New Jersey, and we'll share with you the data that we've collected, the quantitative data as well as the qualitative data. So a little bit about the district. It is a district here in New Jersey. We asked for volunteers. We figure that's a good place to start, where we have teachers volunteering to participate in this pilot program that the district is calling around implementation of the kindergarten guidelines. And I'll talk about those guidelines in just a minute. We had very highly educated teachers on our project. We have them with a range of experience, but generally most had a few years under their belt. And we had some that were really thinking about a transitional approach to bilingual education. So this is a district that is highly are heavily Hispanic. Each teacher reported no less than 15 children in their classroom as having Spanish as their home language. So the schools were fortunate enough to have their early childhood schools. So we have kindergarten and pre-kindergarten in one building, and in the other building we have pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and first grade. So we have administration that should generally know what early childhood looks like. When you look at this information about what the schools are doing, as reported on their websites, as reported by their school report card, it looks pretty good. They have a highly rigorous program, they're developmentally appropriate, they're doing these assessments, they have big blocks of time for language and literacy, they have big blocks of time for mathematics. But we found that perhaps maybe that was not necessarily what was actually being implemented in the classroom. So this district also has a high quality preschool program. They're highly rated. We've worked with them before in their preschool classrooms. Really effective, developmentally appropriate practice there. And what we find is that, as the children move through the classes, going up the grades, the early childhood developmentally appropriate practice sometimes gets shifted out. And there's this pressure from above to really engage in what they consider rigorous practice, but may not necessarily be appropriate for young learners. So this was the purpose, was to gather these teachers. We had 17 that volunteered to really take a close look at their classroom. So we did a pre-assessment. We use our classroom observation tools, and I'll talk about those in just a moment, and analyzed what was happening. We had outside observers come in, and then really use that information, use that classroom quality data to plan the intervention, to think about, well, how can we support the teachers? And we're grounded in these implementation guidelines. So the Department of Education has preschool implementation guidelines, kindergarten implementation guidelines, and as Sharon had mentioned, we are now currently working on the first through third grade implementation guidelines. These are different than standards. These are for teachers, specifically thinking about how to apply appropriate practice in the classroom, what it looks like, what kind of practices should be they should be engaging in. They're divided for kindergarten into three main areas. These are the three areas, and we really wanted to have a focus on, well, what does it look like in the classroom? Because when you read the website on the school district site, they really outline, hey, we're doing all of these great things. And we wanted to think about, well, how does that look to be both academically rigorous as well as developmentally appropriate for our kindergartners? This is just a little information about the guidelines. They've been around for a while, but we found that perhaps not all the teachers were aware of them. Not all the administrators were aware of them. So we needed to really bring them to light, and it speaks to this idea that policy can sometimes be different than practice, right? So Department of Ed has this policy, hey, here's these implementation guidelines, they're used for your reference to improve instruction, but really getting them to the teachers and implementing them has been a challenge. So we started with a close look at the classrooms, the 17 classrooms that we worked with. We had outside observers, so trained assessors from our institute, trained to reliability on these two measures, both the AP, which takes a look at the environment as well as some of the practices. And then, as Sharon had mentioned, Alex developed, was a team developed the CASEBA, which takes a close look at the supports for bilingual children in the classroom. And with such a high Hispanic population, we thought that this was an appropriate tool here. So once we saw what condition our classrooms were in, we decided to come together and really think about how we can move the needle. So here we are with these scores. We want to move them up on this quality measure. Throughout the year, we had two coaches, Jorie and Alex, worked with each of the two schools. Teachers had on average about 19 hours of contact time, so it was not incredibly intense, right? So this was more of a consultation. We did things like professional learning communities. The coaches went in and worked around classroom setup and so forth. We really dug deep into the guidelines with them so that they knew where they were shooting for. We knew that in this first few months, we weren't going to make that shift immediately, but we needed to work in increments. And we really started first with classroom setup, moving to really implementing a schedule that was more appropriate for our young learners, and thinking about shifting from this didactic learning to more of a project-based learning. So here's your paternal, because this is what we uncovered. So that was our intention. Hey, we're going to go in there, we're going to work with these teachers, we're really going to make this impact. And what we found was that we needed to kind of start at the top and start peeling off turtles off that poor teacher's back at the bottom, because there were too many pieces that they didn't have control over. These teachers were willing and ready to make the shift from some of the practices that they had been doing to more appropriate practices outlined in the guidelines, but they had too many restrictions. So kind of went up the chain, and we found that really our intervention needed to start with the administration. We had some professional learning to do for our administrators to support them and really think about easing up on some of these requirements. And as I mentioned, the schedule was the first one that we did. Every kindergarten teacher received the same schedule throughout the district, where from 10:31 to 11:04 you would do math. And from 11:04 to 11:37, you would do science. And you would only do science on Mondays and Wednesdays. So it was really very rigid, and that didn't quite align with the implementation guidelines. So with some coaching of our administrators, we were able to relieve some of that off of the teachers, so we had a little more freedom to make some substantial changes. And we saw a change, which was really exciting. So it took a few months to get the administration on board. So when you think about our school year project, really it was shrunk down to just a few months of direct work with the teachers. And we saw increases both in our APEAK scores as well as the CASEBA scores. Bigger jumps in the APEAK than the CASEBA. So just to dig a little deeper so you can see where we found the changes, these are the APEAK items, and you can see the highlighted ones are the significant change ones. And one that I really wanted to point out here, because it was quite a substantial jump, was number 2, the display of child products. And it seems pretty simple, like, okay, well, in the beginning they had these projects posted where it was cookie cutter. Everyone did the same thing. Everyone had the same product. It looked just like the teacher's model, and that's what was posted. And what happened in order to change that was there was a shift in instruction. So the teachers began to give the children's choice. They began to offer opportunities for them to demonstrate their learning and their understanding in their own way versus this cookie cutter way. So that's really exciting. You will notice that health and classroom safety went the wrong way, which nobody wants to see when you're talking about young children, health and safety. When you dig deeper into the data, they show that this was around hand washing. So in the beginning, they were all gung-ho, let's wash our hands before meals and so forth, and that seemed to taper out as the year went on. So that was a simple reminder. If it's important to wash your hands in September, it's still important to wash your hands in May. So let's keep doing that. The next section on instructional context, we had, again, some big movers here. So when you think about use of materials, again, this was a substantial shift. We had someone go up all the way to a 7, which was the highest score on the APEAK. And we really see this as a direct relation to their change in instruction, where before, in September, there were materials, but they were off limits. Children didn't have access to them. When the teacher put them out, that's when they could use them. When we had looked at the implementation guidelines and we talked more about centers and accessibility and choice, that's when we saw this item increase. Also at the bottom, we had an increase. If you look at integration subjects, in the fall we had no range. everybody got a 1. It's a low score. Nobody was integrating anything. And that was a direct relation to this schedule. The schedule said it's math, and the principal came in with his clock and said, okay, well, it's 10:31, how come you're not doing math? That was a way to monitor. Whereas in the spring, we moved many of the teachers to really think about integrating those subjects through some project-based work. Here's the social context. When you look at the highlighted ones, we have children's role in decision-making. In particular, again, we had someone move up all the way to the highest score, where in the fall, our highest score was a 3. So giving children some ownership in the classroom, some choice, some freedom to express themselves, because they do this in their preschool program. So just moving this idea up to kindergarten can help with the transition so much. If a child at age 4 is going to school and they know school to be this idea where, you know, I have this hour where I get to choose where I want to go, I get to use the materials in the way that I want to, and then all of a sudden now that I'm 5, school is very different. It's a very difficult transition. So working with teachers to give some choice to the children in the classroom. Here's the CASEBA. We had 7 out of the 26 items on the CASEBA inch up. And they generally revolve around using high quality language. And that, again, is a direct relation to changing the approach. So moving away from this didactic, I'm telling you, to asking questions, more open-ended questions, to engaging in discussions, to listening to the children. You'll see on the CASEBA there are items where we're looking at for these criteria to happen in English as well as in Spanish. So I'm going to hand it over to Jorie to really demonstrate for you what the transformation looked like.
Hello, thank you for the nice introduction. Okay, transformation. I'm coming with the pictures and some of the stories from the classroom. So I'm going to speak, but I'm also going to allow the pictures to tell the story. So this is what we walked into in September. The classrooms were full, cluttered. When I look at that classroom, I don't go in and I say, oh, I'm uptight, I'm tense. I felt this in the teachers and I felt this in the children. There was one classroom, one teacher I worked with who was so uptight when I walked in her room. She said, I don't know what to do. I'm so nervous. I'm so uptight. And she really was. And I said, relax, you can do this. And so I said, let's make these changes. Let's see what we can do together. So we pulled out our guidelines. And we started to rearrange the room. So we went from that cluttered to more centers. You can see things are organized. I said, make it like your home. You have different rooms in your home that you want to go into. Use your classroom to organize itself. So get the teacher's desk out of the way. Use the cubbies to help define your areas. And that's fantastic. Turn it around. And on the back side of that, you can display the children's work. And it's at their eye level. Not up high where they can't see it, but down low where it should be. So they can look at it and be proud of what they have done and have conversations about things that they have created. We made child-friendly, we didn't, they made child-friendly signs rather than having your Carson DeLosa or things that you can purchase at the store. Some of my teachers had the children decorate the signs, and that was really great. So they got to make their own rooms in their classroom. I'm taking theirs. Before we started, we had product art. As Shannon said, that cookie cutter. Everything looks the same. You look back here, you have that ugly word dittos. I stabbed myself in the chest with that one. So they have dittos in the classroom. They have the mitten. Jan Brett's the mitten. They had to do some writing, and all the mittens, the pattern, the picture, you know, they had the color. Is the same? Sure, my color's a little different from yours. But what this teacher did so that all the children were different is she put up blue dividers. So no one could copy from anyone else. But then we moved. They heard us, they listened. And then we talked about process art. It's not about the product or what happens at the end. It's about the story getting there. And the children were allowed to make their own story. Look different. This is by this cute little Perez girl. I like a black house. She wrote a nice sentence, and she did black house. They all look different. It's not the same picture. There were no blue things up either, separating. They all had their own pictures. They had process art at their eye level. And more excitingly, and this was the teacher who came up with this, she decided to let the children put their artwork where they wanted to. Not where she went over and said, I'm going to put it here. After they finished, she said, where should we put this? And it was beautiful. And this was the uptight teacher in the beginning. Where should we put this? They got rid of the bells and timers. We said no more bells, no more timers when they went to the centers. So you have 60 minutes and 40 minutes according to the guidelines, page 58. Honestly, please, 58. No, 60 minutes and 40 minutes in these centers. And the teachers were used to bells. I have to turn the timer, you get to go there for 15 minutes and you have to move. My one teacher, she had the timer on the desk with her when I went in when they started. I said, I will be there to support you the day we start this new schedule. She said, okay. She said, do you promise? I said, oh, I do. I will be there. I was in the room. She had the timer on the table next to her. And I said, what are you doing? And she said, I just have it here. I need to have it, but I'm not going to use it. I said, okay. And she didn't. And one little girl in her room, she asked her, she said, how do you know when it's time for you to move? She said, I have an internal clock. I just know. It was great. So in one of the classrooms, another story that developed a project was an interest in buildings. So this little guy, wonderful, I love this little guy. Alex is his name. He decided that he was interested in buildings, and they were studying the three little pigs, and he was saying, you know what, I'm going to draw something. So he did. So he started with an interest. And then he and his friends had a conversation, and they were interested, and they drew as well. And then the teacher, walking around with her clipboard, was listening to this interest. What are the children talking about? What are they interested in? What do they want to know? So she heard this interest in building and sat with them and started asking questions. What do you want to know about buildings? And they came up with questions that they wanted to know. They started, this is one of the teachers, she started by studying these blocks. They're called Kiva planks. Capital blocks, same thing, one's more expensive than the other. They're 1 by 4, they're wonderful. Great for stability, good gravity. Anyhow, she built first because she wanted to understand how the materials work. And I thought that was fantastic. Because if the children have questions and you don't know how something works, then what, right? So she knew, she sat down and played with her Kiva blanks first, and she built that construction. And I thought, wow, that's great. And then they had more explorations. They had a discovery center. Now in their discovery center, they have how they use their center. Again, children's work. Their journal pages up in the center, all different, not cookie cutter. They had some who were interested in looking at buildings and geometry through art. Again, not teacher made, all child made. This one, he told me this was a rocket ship, it wasn't a building. So that's okay. Still studying geometry and putting things together. And then exploring it with math. This one told me about the circles. He said, I have circles inside my circle. I said, okay. Very exciting. So we move from this product to this process, from uptight teachers to teachers who were willing to let go and say, you know what, I can do this, to a schedule that supported what they needed to do to help the children. And look at the Discovery Center now. They use the lab codes to tell how many children can be in that center at a time. That's their classroom management for the Discovery Center. Okay, and now Alex is going to talk more about stories from the classroom.
So in the classrooms that I worked in, I had similar findings as Jorie did in terms of the rigid structure of what things looked like in September. And quite truthfully, it remains that way for me. I would say right through December. These were direct quotes from a PLC that we had together in November. And I thought this was interesting because it really sort of showcases what the anxieties were on behalf of the teachers. Some of them I think are interesting. So we worked through lots of these sort of feelings, but you know, there was this point number 2. Since I got here, it's all been rigorous. So I don't know what it is to be play in kindergarten. So right away I understood that for them, play couldn't be rigorous, at least at this point in time. So we really had to work through some of that and do a shift with them. And so just like Shannon said in the beginning, you know, this impression of science, I'm under the impression that science centers during science. You're saying science during literacy and math. You know, and we had conversations, well, don't you kind of need literacy and math to do science, you know, in the real world? And so, and other pieces that were just much more superficial. You know, I don't want them writing in crayon. This was after a discussion about how to diversify a writing area to make it interesting and to make people want to go there. I said add some different kinds of paper, writing utensils, these kinds of things. So this was my initial sort of meeting with them to understand where they were, what they were thinking. So this was the follow-up PLC as a result of those conversations, and these are the pieces that I chose to focus on with them. Setting up the classroom clearly seemed to be something that was a hurdle. What to put in, managing them, like Jorie said, they were using this very rigid bell system that looked to me more like a prison practice, if anything. Generally, how to use the curriculum in a broad basis. So how to get children to show what they learned through these centers in an academic light, which is what they were really concerned about for when their principal was coming in to observe them. And so around January, I had one teacher that really got, first she called me to tell me that she was going to quit. And I talked her down all the way home in my car, with my children really quiet in the backseat. And I really convinced her that she really could do this, because of all the teachers, I really felt that she understood. She was just really frustrated about how to get the administration to be okay with her carrying out these ideas. So they also were studying structures, and the project became this idea to explore an igloo. And it started with this drawing from a little boy who was a dual language learner. I was really interested in seeing that perspective on things, because I could tell that in Spanish, these kids were extremely verbal. The teachers might not have been understanding that, but I saw that there was a lot to capitalize on there. So this was a little boy who really wasn't talking very much or writing very much, and I have since learned that kindergarten teachers, at least in this setting, are overly obsessed about children writing. And so his word is insect, though he wanted it to say igloo, but the word wall for I shows an insect. So you see where these things are a bit misleading. But generally, I thought it was really interesting, because what she and I talked about in our coaching session was that this was really like an aerial shot he drew of the igloo. So we talked through that, and we talked about using that as a vocabulary word during her mini lesson, and talking about perspective and all of these rigorous academic concepts that we could really come through in a project that was really meaningful to them. So then all the kids decided to start making blueprints for what this project was going to be like. So this one's not an aerial shot, but it is an igloo. And then they decided to make it, but they didn't want to make it where it was a model. They wanted to get in it. So they did some research to figure out what material was a good idea for getting in, and so she found this on the internet. Her first step was to hot glue the pieces together. So one of the things that we sort of worked through was figuring out a way to get the kids to do it on a trial and error basis. So we shifted from hot glue to duct tape. So it was pretty sturdy, but they could remove the pieces if it wasn't working out. So she had to be okay with that. So she wanted it to be right from the start. She had to sort of work through this idea of it not being perfect and all of the learning that was going on to get them to realize it. So after they made the first row and the second row, they quickly realized that they were just stacking like this, and it was going to look more like a Tower of Pisa. So we had to have this really, they had to, I was fortunate enough to be sort of observing on this day, how to figure out how to make a dome shape. So one child, I don't know, they did get there. They needed some support. This is a sign to advertise sort of what it is and who can be in there at what times of the day, because it became like a privacy area. They kept it up for months, and this became the star of the school in this building. She was the underdog. She's now a coach, actually, in the district. So she got a little step up, which was really cool. But they did get an architect to come from NJIT. He spent a long time in the classroom. He loved the Kiva planks and the children. One child built the Empire State Building. He told the kid it was good. The kid said, I know. So the kids, I mean, there was this really huge shift in the kids' confidence, particularly in those children who were not really comfortable speaking English. Suddenly, they were a little bit less anxious about worrying about all of these dittos and very structured lessons, and everybody was talking, everybody was writing, so the teacher really got engaged, and so did the kids. And so towards the end, we redid another interview, and I sort of, with Shannon and Jorie, picked out the pieces that I felt are most interesting from a qualitative perspective about the process that the teachers went through. And these are sort of the teachers' change, you know, what their impression of their own changes were. And some of them are really interesting. And they still talk about what their challenges are. You know, how do I do center time and still have to do guided reading? And they still know they have to really hone in on these skills before they finish the year. So some of these are pretty telling, I think. Towards the end, they felt that they had this sort of free-range approach where if someone came in, they were allowed to say, well, we're part of the pilot. And that really helped them. But we did have lots of conversations about saying, I told them, yes, you're part of the pilot, but all of these practices are grounded in the guidelines and the Common Core. And one day we pulled out the Common Core and we read them, and they really were like, oh my gosh, we really are. We're really doing all of these things. I'm like, yeah, you are. So pull them out when Mr. M comes and show him that you're really addressing these standards. This was their feelings on the children's response to the change. Number one is really cool. The kids were happy. I will add that in this school, the kids had 0 recess time. That has since changed. So the children would come to school and never leave their classroom until dismissal. I have a kindergarten student, almost 2, and this was like very sad to me. And you could see in their own anxiety in the classroom that they were really lacking some active free play time. During center time, he's not a problem anymore. So there was a lot of discussion about how children who were being problematic were suddenly less problematic in this environment. There was a lot of realization about pulling from students' interests and how all of a sudden they were more interested because they were working on stuff that they were enjoying. These were the teachers' thoughts on learning. I won't read through all of them, but I really wanted to highlight the last points. You know, we thought kindergarten guidelines just meant let your kids go crazy. So there again, they were really this understanding of rigor and play and developmentally appropriate practice were just not lined up for them at the beginning. At the end, I think we got closer to that. This was one of their biggest hurdles, and we have since worked with the district a little bit, and we're still slowly transitioning, but they had so many assessments that they were responsible for that the last point became a realization for them. We can't do this style when the assessment style doesn't match. So that's the piece that we're working on now, and they've since shifted to a more formative assessment, though they've not divorced themselves of a bunch of other ones, so they're kind of doing it in addition to, but we'll get there. So at least in June, this was where we left off for next steps and support. This was their direct feelings about what they needed to move forward for this year. They really expressed this need for the alignment on the district's behalf from the administration, so that things felt well aligned. Because even the building principal in this school was really concerned about what was going on there that he was going to get in trouble for. So the big quote was, "Oh, that comes from downtown," So there was a lot of this sort of blame to cover up the accountability that they were trying to make sure that they had, and it was very interesting. So we're ending with where we are right now. We are in year 2 of this project currently. What Jorie and I are doing for this school year is to really continue to use that data that we collected at the end of the spring to really inform coaching. So in the last year, while we did some coaching, we really had to put so much emphasis on restructuring the environments that we weren't able to get as deep into the coaching as we might have liked, but that was what we found when we got there. So the plan is to increase that direct coaching. I feel that I have a much better handle on the culture of that school building now, so it's easier for me. I know the teachers more personally. I'm really planning on relying lots on video recording so that as post-conference meetings, we can watch them together and really just have conversations around that. We'll continue with PLCs, and we are definitely continuing with our meetings with the district and the central administration. So we're in it. I've been to the school last week. Things seem to be moving the way that they ended. For some, for others, they feel like they need to start in a rigid place to move. Others don't. So the coolest part about the project is that we're just very responsive to each particular teacher and their style. And we have slow adopters and fast adopters, and so we'll see what happens by the spring. And that's it.
Oh, so we're going to open up for questions and comments.
Oh, wow.
Okay, Kate.
So you said that you spent 19 hours of coaching. How much time did you actually spend in each classroom?
It varied.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some teachers that were on the high end of the average, whereas others, very low on the end. So it varied.
At the back there, and then Katie, and then Glenn. What kind of schedule changes did you actually make? You can give an example of how you shifted from a rigorous schedule, a strict schedule, to what it actually looked like, and then maybe a follow-up is the integration of the subject.
I actually carry the guidelines with me wherever I go in case I need to refer to them. Like I told you, page 58, the guidelines. What we did was move, like Alex said, everything was in chunks. You had math, you had science, you had social studies, and you can only do social studies on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But if you look, and what we said to them was, if you look at the guidelines, let's open the book to page 58 and look at the guidelines. You've got a whole hour, 60 minutes that they say. Again, it depends upon the reality of your classroom and how your schedule is now, where you could pull stuff together. Why can't you have a social studies center? Why can't you have a science or discovery center where you're running a project where you have things working from there? Why can't math be integrated? And that's what we tried to help them try to see, is that it's not just, we're going to go outside and look at the sky and talk about science, and we're just going to look at the sky. Well, you have to have a conversation to talk about that. So there's language that's involved there. There are other things that's involved there. It's not just science alone. So it was getting them to step to say, okay, we can move to centers. That was the first, I think, big thing. And rearranging the room to support that. And then moving to say, okay, well, how can we integrate this and what does that look like? But again, page 58. And these are available on the DOE website.
Yes, they are. Katie, and then Brandon, and then Karen. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, we didn't take away the actual direct instruction. So direct instruction is still a component of this approach. It's just that there are smaller blocks of time, so things like mini lessons, and then the children go out and apply the skill or the strategy, whatever we're honing in on. So there is much more choice and much more freedom, but there is that direct tie to standards and their curriculum as well.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about those initial meetings with administration around issues like this, that question. And I know you use the guidelines to sort of support those conversations, but what those conversations entailed and what work had to be done in order to come to an agreement.
Well, the first thing was we had to have the right people in the room, right? So we needed to first figure that out because we had been working with the early childhood director who was 100% on board on this, but she necessarily didn't have the only authority over kindergarten. So we needed to pull in the curriculum director as well as
Literacy coach.
a literacy coach, so that we were getting all of the right people in the room and having the same conversation. And, you know, we use this term pilot, I hate it, but that was our entree, right? Well, we're just trying this. Let's just try this and see. So the most thrilling part was in the spring to share the results and say, we're not there yet, but look at how far these teachers have come in such a short amount of time. So that's how we couched it.
Brandon?
I have a question about the coding scheme. Can you talk about that? Because some of those items seem very difficult to measure.
So the instruments that we used?
Yes.
Those are, the APK is a standardized tool. It's a 7-point scale, and there's indicators under 4 anchor score points. And we train observers to reliability so that when we all go out in the field, we reach a certain level of agreement at least 3 times, so that we know that if I do it or Shannon does it, we're gonna score that indicator in the same way. So the APK has 16 items, and the Kiseba has 26 items, and it is pretty intricate, but it takes about 3 hours to do. So you sit in the classroom for a period of about 3 hours, taking notes, and basically the indicators are yes/no questions. So, you know, are the children allowed to access materials without permission from the teacher, yes or no? So that's just one of the indicators on the accessibility item, let's say, for an example. So it is complicated, but we do it pretty successfully every time.
Brandon, are you asking how they get to a final score? Is that what you're also asking?
No, but that would be an interesting
It's kind of a left to right procedure. So if you're saying yes to the indicators all the way along the line, eventually you get to a score. So if, you know, all of these things are met, then it's a 3. If all of these things plus those are met, then it's a 4. So that's kind of the thinking of the scoring process.
Dr. Logan.
I think I have 2 separate questions. One was, and I don't know if you have your slides memorized with the quantitative, but I was surprised that with all of the changes you did see, that it seemed like instructional methods had changed significantly. Do you have an understanding of that? Is that because of the direct instruction time that you're talking about?
My sort of anecdotal observation is that I don't think that has changed yet. My initial observation last week is that while they're using the centers, they're still not really understanding what to do in them. Mm-hmm. They're not still clear on
what their job is during that time.
Exactly. Right. So because the schedule has changed a little bit, doesn't mean that it's changed totally. So that they still have a block schedule essentially, but there's 2 independent work times set up during the day, where after they teach their math mini lesson, the children are allowed to break out into these centers. So that's where my focus is going to be with them for this year, because I don't think they fully understand yet how to move children along. I think the new assessment is going to help them understand this better. But that's why. I think that most of the changes that we saw are more about structure and less about process.
Although it's interesting because they were doing these very intricate projects, like the Igloo project, that even very experienced, people who are very experienced with the project approach, that's a fairly sophisticated one. I would have thought, that's what I'm saying, I would have thought that would have showed up.
But she was one of
I see what you're saying, it's an aggregate.
She was she was sort of like ready for the whole thing, and that's why I think she was ready to jump.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't sure if she was going to be allowed to do it, but she knew in her head where she wanted to go with it.
Can I ask a second?
Yes.
Actually, it was off of the question that was asked a little while ago. When you say, look at, that the administrators had the experience of look at how far these teachers have come in such a short time, was how far based on the changes in these environmental things, not assessment of the children?
Right.
And so that already seems like a winning over of the administrators. Do you know what I mean? To be judging their teachers, because you're taking a measure that is already different than what most administrators are looking for in a classroom. And you're convincing them, unless they're just assessment crazy, which I believe could be that they just said, oh, it went up. It doesn't even matter what it was that happened. But so was there a process by which they were won over to the assessment as being a quality change that they wanted?
So we needed to tie it to their teacher evaluation system.
Uh-huh.
So we had many conversations about how this is related. We did a little crosswalk for them that, okay, well, in the Danielson model, this is where you'll see APEAK number 3 kind of thing.
Okay.
So we needed to show them our measures were interlocked with what they were currently doing.
Okay.
Question. It's just looking at the pictures and hearing the testimonials, you see a lot of transformation. But I'm wondering in your data, so you measured in the fall and you measured in the spring, do you think any of that changed because the natural evolution of teaching over the course of the school year? So in the fall, you're establishing classroom routines, you're keeping a tighter grip on it, and you tend to open up and maybe be a little more creative as we look towards the spring, or?
No, so we have results from APEAK that they've done in the district from several years ago, and they were all conducted in the spring, and they're just as low. And I think by the understanding of how their curriculum worked and how their schedule worked and all, I don't think they ever got to that spring, hey, now I can.
Okay. I'm wondering if someone can speak to the lack of awareness of the kindergarten guidelines by the teachers in the schools, because I know in pre-K, New Jersey's pre-K implementation guidelines, they structure the whole entire program. I mean, they dictate how many teachers are there, how many kids are there. It is the policy, and I'm just confused about why that policy isn't being honored in the same way that the other state policies for K-3 are.
So it's not code.
Okay.
Right. So it's a policy, it's an understanding, it's an offering that the Department of Education has, but there is no mandate. And mostly because there's no mandate for kindergarten, even in New Jersey. So they're not able to say that everyone must follow these guidelines. But, to the DOE's credit, they are doing a lot of outreach. They do hold the kindergarten seminars that are free and open and offered repeatedly. So the resources are there. Districts coming, they're still working on that. And I think a big part that will boost that is, as Alex mentioned, the kindergarten entry assessment. So this district, as well as I think maybe 80 or so around the state, has shifted to participate in the department's voluntary and funded initiative for the kindergarten entry assessment, which does shift from this one-on-one direct didactic assessment to observation and formative assessment throughout the year.
So I had one question about the parents. Did you have any interaction with the parents of the children?
The teachers.
Was there any pushback?
The teachers really interact with the parents.
So there was no pushback from
No.
families about these changes?
I'm not really sure how aware they made parents that they were changing it.
Okay, fair enough.
Any other questions or comments? So a lot of people in this room might not think that like pre-K, K, 1, 2 is important, but it's really interesting to know. I'm just saying, just some people might not. Let's think about Sure. I'm just saying, some people don't understand the relevance of, but the state has a race to the top national early challenge grant, which is worth us billions of dollars, with the idea of trying to push inquiry-based, developmentally appropriate instruction from pre-K all the way up to 3rd grade, because the evidence, which is longitudinal, shows that over time, if kids don't have that, they actually don't perform as well on academics tests in 3rd grade. So I have a student who's doing a doctoral study on the the new next generation science standards. Yes, me, an early childhood person, but that's what I'm doing. And she's doing that in a teacher education study. And it's fascinating to me how the inquiry work that we talk about in early childhood really forms the foundation for that kind of stuff in middle and high school. And yet it's such a hard push with administrators no matter where you are. And certainly something we've learned in the 1st through 3rd grade guidelines, and we've done a lot of focus groups with teachers about how to move things forward, has been, you've really got to get our administrators on board. And that is really key because they feel so pressured with the various kinds of assessments and accountability moves in this state that they feel like they can't teach in any other way but didactically, which is sad to see, particularly those of you who have high schools currently. Okay, so with that, I'm going to say thank you to my mates from NEAR. Well done.